The crunch of frozen pine needles beneath my combat boots was the only sound for miles. That should have been my first warning. My name is Jonah Vance. I've spent the last 12 years working as a remote wilderness surveyor, mapping out the black zones, those blank, jagged patches on federal topographical maps where satellites can't get a clear readout through the dense canopy or the mountain interference. I'm not a weekend hiker. I don't get spooked by a snapping twig or the distant howl of a gray wolf. I know how the woods breathe. I know their rhythms. But the cascades this close to the northern border felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on my chest, trying to force the breath back into my lungs. It was 3:42 p.m. The winter sun was already dipping behind the jagged teeth of the western ridges, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the valley floor. I stopped by a massive, lightning-scarred cedar tree to check my gear. GPS is fluctuating, I muttered to myself. The digital screen flickered, the coordinates spinning wildly before blanking out entirely. Retention loop note. If a digital instrument fails in the backcountry, you don't panic. You switch to analog. But what happens when analog stops working, too? I unclipped the heavy, military-grade liquid compass from my tactical vest. I opened the brass casing, expecting the needle to swing cleanly toward the magnetic north. Instead, it was spinning. Slow, agonizingly deliberate circles, like a dying clock. I frowned, tapping the glass. Come on, work. Suddenly, the spinning stopped. The needle snapped hard toward the deepest, darkest canyon of the valley, the exact opposite direction of north. And then the forest went completely dead. Not just quiet, dead. If you've ever been deep in the wilderness, you know it's never actually silent. There is always the rustle of dry leaves, the chattering of squirrels, the distant creak of ancient timber bending in the wind, or the high-pitched hum of insects. It's a constant white noise symphony that lets you know the ecosystem is alive. But within a single heartbeat, all of it was severed. It was as if someone had hit a master mute switch on the universe. The wind didn't die down, it just stopped moving. The branches above me froze in mid-sway. My own breathing sounded terrifyingly loud, echoing inside my skull like a bass drum. I stood frozen, my hands still holding the useless compass. Every survival instinct I had developed over a decade slammed into high gear. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. Something was wrong with the physics of this place. I took a deep, deliberate breath, trying to calm the sudden spike of adrenaline in my veins. Think, Jonah, I told myself. Barometric pressure drop? An inversion layer? I needed to test the air. I raised my hands and clapped them together with all my might. Nothing. The sound didn't travel. There was a dull, muffled thud, as if I had clapped my hands inside a soundproof recording studio lined with heavy velvet. No echo bounced off the canyon walls. The sound simply died the millimeter it left my palms. Fear, cold and sharp, began to coil around my spine. I decided right then to abandon the survey. The mapping could wait. I needed to hike back out to the base camp cabin 3 miles up the ridge. I turned on my heel, ready to retrace my steps along the faint game trail I had been following. That's when I noticed the snow. It had started falling 10 minutes ago. Heavy, fat flakes that should have been drifting lazily to the earth. But they weren't drifting. They were falling straight down, perfectly vertical with unnatural speed, as if being pulled to the ground by an intensified localized gravity. And when they hit the dry leaves, they made absolutely no sound. I began to walk fast, my pace quickening into a light jog. The silence was suffocating. It felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums, a high-pressure vacuum that made me want to scream just to prove I wasn't deaf. "Hey!" I shouted into the trees. "Is anyone out there?" The words dropped out of my mouth like stones. They didn't ring through the forest. They felt flattened, choked out by the atmosphere. Then came the first visual anomaly. Ahead of me, about 50 yards down the trail, stood a massive black bear. It was a mature boar, easily 400 pounds. Under normal circumstances, encountering a bear on foot is a high-stress scenario. But this wasn't normal. The bear wasn't looking at me. It was standing on all fours, completely rigid. Its mouth was wide open in what looked like a ferocious roar, its thick lips pulled back to expose yellowed canine teeth. But there was no sound coming out of it. Not a growl, not a huff. More terrifyingly, it wasn't moving. Not an inch. Its chest wasn't rising or falling with breath. Its eyes, glassy and dark, were staring fixatedly into the dense thicket to the left of the trail. It looked like a taxidermy model frozen in a state of absolute primal terror. I slowly backed away from the frozen beast, my hand gripping the bare mace at my hip, though deep down, I knew pepper spray wasn't going to save me from whatever was happening here. I detoured off the trail, cutting through a dense grove of pine trees to give the bear a wide berth. Every step required immense physical effort. The air felt thick, viscous, like walking chest-deep through water. I looked down at my tactical watch. The digital face was blank. The rugged, battery-powered survival watch that was supposed to last 10 years without a charge had died. I glanced at my backup analog watch on my right wrist. The mechanical second hand was twitching violently in place, unable to move forward, vibrating like a trapped insect. Time itself felt like it was breaking down. The temperature was plummeting at an impossible rate. It had been a manageable 28 degrees Fahrenheit when I started my hike. Now, with every breath I took, my lungs burned as if I were inhaling shattered glass. The moisture on my eyelashes was instantly turning to frost. I needed shelter, and I needed it immediately. Hypothermia would claim me long before I could make it back to the ridge cabin at this pace. Through the gloom of the fading twilight, I spotted a rock formation, a massive limestone overhang that formed a shallow, natural cave. It wasn't perfect, but it would block the vertical snowfall and give me a defensible position to build a fire. I scrambled toward it, my boots slipping on the unnaturally slick rocks. As I entered the mouth of the shallow cave, a sudden wave of nausea hit me. The air inside smelled faintly of ozone and old, stagnant copper. The unmistakable scent of a heavy electrical storm, yet there was no lightning. I dropped my heavy pack onto the stone floor. The impact was completely silent. I knelt down, my hands shaking violently from the creeping chill. I pulled out my waterproof match container and a handful of dry birch bark tinder I always kept in my survival kit. I struck a match against the striker pad. A bright, brilliant spark flared. The match caught. A small, yellow flame began to dance on the wood. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Fire meant warmth. Fire meant light. But as I watched the flame, my relief vanished, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. The flame wasn't flickering. There was no smoke rising from it. The fire stood perfectly still, a solid cone of orange and yellow light, frozen in mid-combustion. I cautiously extended my gloved hand toward it. There was no heat. I touched the flame itself with the tip of my leather glove. The leather didn't burn. The fire was bright. It was visually real, but it possessed absolutely no thermal energy. It was a phantom, tension scene. I sat alone in the dark cave, staring at a fire that couldn't burn, surrounded by a forest that couldn't make a sound. And that's when I heard it. Not a sound through the air, but a vibration, directly inside the bones of my skull. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming. Thump, 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 like a massive, mechanical heartbeat buried deep beneath the granite roots of the mountain. And then, out in the pitch-black woods, a flashlight beam cut through the trees. Someone was out there. They were waving a light wildly, moving erratically through the dense brush, heading straight toward my cave. I flattened myself against the cold stone wall of the cave, reaching into my pack for my survival hatchet. My heart was hammering so hard against my ribs I was certain it would shatter them. The light outside flickered violently, cutting through the heavy snowfall. It was a cold, blue-white LED beam. Then, a voice broke through the silence, but it didn't travel through the air. Just like the low, thrumming heartbeat, the voice echoed directly inside my head, bypassing my ears entirely. It was a harsh, jarring frequency that made my teeth ache. Jonah? Jonah, is that you out there? Please help me. I'm lost. My gear dropped dead. My breath hitched. The voice, it sounded exactly like Marcus. Marcus was my closest friend, another surveyor who worked for the same department. But Marcus wasn't assigned to this sector. He was supposed to be 300 miles away, mapping the coastal ranges in Oregon. "Jonah, I see your fire. I'm coming in," the voice screamed inside my skull. The flashlight beam bounced closer, illuminating the dense pine branches just 30 yards from the cave mouth. I could see a silhouette now, a tall figure clad in a heavy winter parka, identical to the departmental issue gear we both wore. I opened my mouth to call out to him, to warn him about the fire and the absolute silence. But something stopped me. A tiny, rational voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. "Look at the way he's moving." The silhouette wasn't walking like a human through heavy snow. It was moving in strange, jerky, unnatural bursts. It would freeze perfectly still for 2 seconds, then instantly teleport forward 10 feet in a blur of motion, like a skipping frame in an old film reel. The light it was holding didn't cast natural shadows. The shadows cast by the trees were bending toward the light source, rather than away from it. "Jonah, thank God. It's freezing out here," Marcus's voice cried out again in my head. The tone was frantic, terrified, perfectly human. But the silhouette had reached the edge of the clearing just outside my cave. The blue-white light washed over the frozen bear I had passed earlier. The figure didn't react to the massive predator. It just glided past it. As the figure stepped into the dim, heatless orange glow of my frozen fire, the light hit its face. My blood turned to pure ice. It wasn't Marcus. It had Marcus's face, yes, the short brown beard, the small scar over the left eyebrow, but the features were wrong. They were stretched too wide, like a latex mask being pulled taut by invisible hands. The eyes were completely solid, glossy black, lacking any whites or pupils. And worst of all, its mouth wasn't moving. The jaw was completely locked shut, clamped together tightly. Even while Marcus's terrified, desperate voice continued to scream inside my mind. "Jonah, please, open the door. Let me in. I'm right outside." The entity stood at the entrance of the cave, its black, hollow eyes staring directly into the dark corner where I was crouching. It slowly raised its left arm. The joints made a horrifying, wet cracking sound that I couldn't hear, but could feel vibrating through my own jawbone. It pointed its long, unnaturally elongated finger right at my chest. The entity at the cave mouth did not breathe. In the frozen, heatless glow of my phantom fire, its chest remained perfectly still, a solid block of mock-human flesh disguised in a surveyor's parka. I pressed my back harder against the limestone wall, my fingers white-knuckled around the handle of my survival hatchet. Every instinct I possessed, every hour spent tracking, navigating, and surviving the untamed valleys of the Cascades, told me that if I blinked, if I let my gaze slip from those glassy, pitch-black voids it used for eyes, I would become just another frozen monument in this silent valley. "Jonah, why won't you answer me?" The voice inside my skull was losing its human warmth. The frequency shifted, degrading like a low-bit-rate audio file tearing apart under a poor connection. The word Jonah sounded like two flat pieces of rusted iron sliding over one another, yet it was still Marcus's pitch. It was an acoustic theft. The thing took a step forward. Its movement was instant. There was no transition, no shifting of weight or bending of knees. 1 microsecond it was at the threshold. The next, it was 3 feet inside, its boot leaving an absolute indentation in the silent snow that didn't crunch. The absolute lack of kinetic sound made my inner ear throb with vertigo. Retention loop note. When the human brain is deprived of auditory feedback, it begins to manufacture its own. But the sounds filling my head weren't hallucinations. They were the shifting gears of a trap closing around me. I knew I couldn't fight it with steel. A hatchet was meant for wood and bone. This thing moved through the frames of reality like a broken projection. I looked down at my survival pack, lying completely silent on the frozen mud between us. Hidden in the side pocket was a high-intensity magnesium flare, the kind used for signaling search and rescue choppers through dense winter fog. The entity's hand, with fingers that seemed to have one too many knuckles, twitched toward me. With a desperate lunge, I dropped to my knees, ignoring the agonizing scrape of the stone against my shins. I unzipped the pack, the zipper teeth moving in absolute, eerie silence, and wrapped my fingers around the rough cardboard casing of the flare. The thing moved again. It was now close enough that I could see the texture of its skin. It wasn't skin at all. It looked like poured gray silicone, molded to resemble human pores, but completely devoid of sweat, oil, or hair. The face of my oldest friend was merely a coat of paint over something ancient and hollow. I ripped the strike cap off the flare and slammed it against the abrasive head. A blinding, brilliant fountain of crimson light erupted into the cave. Magnesium burns at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It should have hissed. It should have roared like a jet engine. It should have filled the limestone chamber with a suffocating cloud of white smoke. Instead, the red light exploded in total, suffocating stillness. But the heat was real. Unlike the phantom fire I had tried to build earlier, the flare's chemical reaction was too violent for the localized vacuum to suppress. A wave of scorching, dry heat slammed into my face, instantly melting the frost on my eyelashes. The entity recoiled. For the first time, its locked jaw split open, revealing a smooth, featureless gray cavity where teeth and a tongue should have been. A soundless scream vibrated through my skull, a high-pitched, agonizing drone that felt like a drill piercing my temple. It stumbled backward, its limbs flailing in jerky, unnatural angles as the intense crimson radiation washed over its gray form. The silicone flesh began to bubble and blacken, peeling away to reveal something that looked like iridescent black glass beneath. I didn't wait to see what it looked like fully uncovered. I grabbed my pack, thrust the burning flare ahead of me like a sword, and charged out of the cave into the dead vertical snowfall. I ran blindly through the dense thicket, the crimson glare of the flare casting long, monstrous shadows through the frozen pines. The vertical snow was falling faster now, hitting my jacket like pellets of lead. The air was no longer just cold, it was heavy. Every step felt as though my boots were caked in thick, wet cement. The localized gravity was intensifying with every yard I descended into the canyon floor. I looked back over my shoulder. Through the dark, intersecting branches, I could see flashes of blue-white light. The entity was following me. It wasn't running. It was skipping through the terrain, its flashlight beam cutting through the forest like a searchlight. And it wasn't alone. Jonah! Wait up! Jonah! We found your signal. Jonah Vance, hold your position. Multiple voices were entering my mind now. They were overlapping, a chaotic chorus of people I knew. I heard my mother's voice from 5 years ago. I heard the voice of my supervisor from the regional mapping office. I even heard my own voice, a perfect, clear recording of a radio transmission I had made 3 days prior, playing back inside my head with pristine accuracy. Sector 4 is clear, heading down to the tributary now. They were trying to disorient me, trying to fracture my focus so I would trip, slow down, or give up. The forest wasn't just a place anymore. It was an intelligence, an acoustic predator that used our own vocal history as bait. I forced my eyes forward, focusing entirely on the terrain. The ground was sloping sharply downward, leading toward the bottom of the canyon where the tributary creek should have been. But as I broke through a final line of hemlock trees, I realized the geography had changed. The creek wasn't there. In its place was a massive, perfectly circular depression in the earth. A crater easily 200 yards wide, carved out of the solid granite bedrock. The snow didn't accumulate inside the circle. It seemed to vaporize or pull straight into the center, where a colossal, black obsidian pillar rose from the depths of the stone. The pillar was covered in intricate, geometric grooves that pulsed with a faint, sickly greenish light. The low, rhythmic thrumming I had felt in my bones earlier was deafening now. It wasn't a sound. It was a rhythmic pressure wave that made my vision blur with every pulse. Thump, thump, thump. It was the heartbeat of the mountain, and it was originating from the base of that pillar. I stood at the lip of the crater, my magnesium flare sputtering out, its red light dying down to a dull, smoking stub. The gravity here was immense. I could barely lift my arms. My chin was being forced down toward my chest by an unseen weight. Behind me, the voices stopped. I turned slowly, my muscles screaming from the exertion. Standing at the tree line were 5 silhouettes. All of them wore surveyor parkas. All of them had faces stolen from my memories. They stood in a perfect, silent semicircle, locking me into the crater's edge. From the center of the group, a new figure stepped forward. It didn't wear a parka. It wore an old, tattered wool coat that belonged to my grandfather, a man who had died when I was a child. The face was an exact, pale replica of his, right down to the wire-rimmed spectacles. The jaw remained locked, but the voice that entered my mind was deep, resonant, and ancient. It didn't sound like my grandfather. It sounded like the earth itself breaking apart. "You have mapped too far, surveyor. You have reached the edge of the script." I couldn't speak. The atmospheric pressure at the edge of the crater was so high that if I opened my mouth, the air would be sucked from my lungs instantly. I could only stand there, my knees buckling under the unnatural weight, staring at the stolen face of my ancestor. "The surface of this world is a thin veneer." The voice boomed inside my skull, vibrating through my teeth until they felt loose in their sockets. A layer of noise designed to keep the organic matter occupied. But beneath the noise, there is only the code. There is only the silence. The 5 entities stepped forward in perfect unison, their bodies skipping through space in those horrifying, erratic jolts. They didn't use weapons. They didn't need them. The gravity they radiated was enough to pin me to the stone. I fell to my hands and knees, the granite cold beneath my palms. The magnesium flare fell from my fingers, rolling silently down the slope toward the obsidian pillar. As it entered the greenish light radiating from the structure, the cardboard casing didn't just sit there. It began to dissolve, turning into fine, gray dust that was pulled into the geometric grooves of the stone. The pillar was consuming physical matter, rewriting it into nothingness. "Your species is a virus of sound," the ancient voice continued, the grandfather facsimile moving closer, its black eyes reflecting the sickly green glow of the column. "You fill the vacuum with your screams, your music, your meaningless maps. You attempt to define that which was meant to remain formless. But the cycle has reached its rotation. The wilderness is reclaiming its parameters." I realized then what this valley was. It wasn't a natural anomaly. It was a cleanup protocol. A localized deletion zone where the physical rules of the world were being unmade, starting with the sound, moving to the climate, and ending with the biology. I looked down at my hands. Through my heavy survival gloves, I could feel a strange, numbing sensation. I pulled the left glove off with my teeth, a violent gasp escaping my throat into the vacuum. My skin was changing. The blood in my veins was no longer red. It was a dark, iridescent blue, visible through skin that was turning translucent and smooth, losing its hair and texture. My fingernails were hardening, turning into dark, glass-like ridges. "Do not fight the transition, Jonah," the voice whispered, now sounding smooth, almost maternal, shifting to the frequency of my mother's voice. "In the silence, there is no pain. There is no memory of loss. There is only permanent function." The 5 figures reached the lip of the crater. They extended their smooth, gray hands toward me, ready to drag me down into the pulsing green core of the pillar. But as my fingers brushed against the raw granite of the crater floor, my hand slipped into a crevice. My fingers wrapped around something hard, cold, and metallic. It wasn't stone, and it wasn't silicone. It was an old, rusted iron piton, a climbing anchor left behind by some forgotten mountaineer decades ago, before this sector was classified as a black zone. It was a piece of raw, unadulterated human history, anchored deep into the living rock. A surge of stubborn, human defiance flared through my chest. "I am not a line of code," I thought, my teeth grinding together until my gums bled. "I am Jonah Vance, and I don't give up my map." With a final, explosive burst of strength, I hauled myself forward, using the iron piton as leverage, and swung my survival hatchet not at the entities, but hard into the pulsing green groove of the obsidian pillar that sat just within my reach at the crater's base. The steel blade struck the ancient stone with an explosion of silent sparks. The impact of the steel hatchet against the obsidian pillar didn't produce a sound, but it caused a cataclysm. The moment the metal bit into the glowing, geometric groove, a visible shockwave rippled outward through the air. It wasn't a shockwave of force or wind. It was a distortion of reality itself. The vertical snowfall instantly reversed direction, flying upward into the black sky like a billion silver needles. The oppressive, cement-like gravity shattered, lifting my chest off the stone so suddenly that I gasped, my lungs tearing at the thin, frozen air. The green light inside the pillar didn't fade. It fractured. It split into 1,000 jagged, glowing lines that bled across the surface of the crater like spilled ink. And then the silence broke. It started as a low, agonizing groan from the belly of the earth, a sound like continental plates grinding against one another at high speed. But within milliseconds, that groan devolved into a chaotic, terrifying cacophony of human audio. The entity had lost control of its library. Every sound it had ever recorded, every voice it had stolen to construct this localized parameters loop, came screaming out of the obsidian core all at once. "Jonah, look at this tree," Marcus's voice. "The weather advisory says to stay indoors." A radio announcer from 1994. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Chopper 7 Delta." A frantic pilot from a forgotten rescue mission. "I think we're lost, Sarah. The compass is spinning." A terrified hiker. The voices didn't play in sequence. They played stacked on top of one another. A towering wall of acoustic madness that vibrated the fillings in my teeth and made blood trickle from my left ear. I clutched my head, dropping the hatchet as I rolled onto my side on the sharp granite. I looked up at the tree line. The 5 figures in surveyor parkas were violently glitching. Their bodies no longer skipped smoothly through frames of space. Instead, they were tearing apart. One moment, the figure of my grandfather was 10 feet tall. Its limbs stretched into thin, gray ribbons. The next, it was compressed into a flat, two-dimensional silhouette against the dark pines. Their stolen faces melted, sliding off their skulls like hot wax, revealing the uniform, iridescent black glass beneath. The system was crashing. The cleanup protocol had been corrupted by a piece of raw, historical iron and an act of unprogrammed human resistance. Retention loop note. In standard mapping protocols, an anomaly that cannot be integrated or deleted causes a systemic cascade failure. The valley wasn't just resetting anymore. It was tearing itself out of the world's ledger. The crater floor began to tilt. The massive granite slabs beneath me fractured with sounds like lightning strikes, tilting upward at impossible angles. The obsidian pillar began to sink, pulling into the earth like a piston, dragging the geometry of the canyon down with it. I knew that if I stayed in this depression for another 60 seconds, I would be buried beneath 1 billion tons of non-euclidean stone. I didn't have my glove. My bare left hand was still translucent, the dark blue veins pulsing with an erratic, fading light as the transformation stalled. I forced myself onto my feet, every muscle screaming in protest, and began to claw my way up the crumbling slope of the crater, away from the screaming pillar. The entities didn't follow me. They couldn't. They were being pulled backward into the sinking core, their glass limbs shattering as they collided with the shifting stone. The last thing I saw of them was the grandfather facsimile, its hand stretched toward the sky, dissolving into the same gray dust that had consumed my magnesium flare. I reached the lip of the crater, threw myself over the fractured rim, and ran into the bleeding forest. The run back up the canyon was a blur of survival horror. The forest was no longer acting as a stable environment. Trees were flickering between solid wood and pixelated, hollow wireframes. The sky above wasn't dark anymore. It was a swirling vortex of static, flashing between pitch black and a sickly, glowing white that had no source. The vertical snow had turned into a chaotic storm of ash-like particles that dissolved into nothingness before they touched the ground. I didn't look at my compass. I didn't trust my eyes. I trusted only the slope. As long as the ground went up, I was moving away from the center of the deletion. My breathing was a ragged, whistling gasp. The air felt thin, devoid of oxygen, as if the atmosphere itself was being pumped out of the valley. My bare left hand was completely numb, a stiff, glassy appendage that I had to tuck into my jacket pocket just to keep from striking it against the branches. Just keep moving? I muttered to myself, but my own voice sounded strange to my ears. It was muffled, flat, as if I were speaking through a heavy woolen blanket. The acoustic dampening was returning, but it wasn't the entity doing it this time. It was the world closing the wound. After what felt like hours of agonizing climbing, the terrain began to level off. The dense, flickering hemlocks gave way to the familiar, jagged rocks of the ridge line. I staggered through a final thicket of brush and fell forward onto the hard-packed, natural snow of the upper pass. I turned around, panting, my chest heaving as I looked back down into the valley. The canyon was gone. Where the deep, heavily forested valley had been just 3 hours ago, there was now only a flat, featureless plateau of gray granite. No trees, no creek, no snow, just a massive, smooth scar in the landscape, stretching for miles between the mountain ridges. It looked exactly like a section of a map that had been erased with a brutal, indifferent hand, leaving only the blank canvas underneath. The silence here was different. It wasn't the dead, predatory vacuum of the entity. It was the normal, quiet stillness of a high mountain winter night. A soft wind blew across the ridge, carrying the genuine scent of pine and ozone. The stars above were stable, sharp points of light in a clear, natural sky. I lay there for a long time, the cold of the real snow seeping through my trousers, reassuring me that I was back within the parameters of the known world. I had survived. I had kept my map. Slowly, painfully, I pulled my left hand out of my jacket pocket to inspect the damage. The translucency was gone. The dark blue veins had receded. But my skin was different now. It was entirely smooth, devoid of hair, pores, or lines. My fingerprints were completely gone, replaced by a uniform, pale gray texture that felt slightly cool to the touch. A permanent scar of the deletion zone, a receipt for my survival. I pulled my spare glove over the altered hand, stood up on shaking legs, and began the long, dark walk down the southern slope toward the ranger station at the highway. I had a story to tell, even if I knew no one would ever believe it. The run back up the canyon was a blur of survival horror. The forest was no longer acting as a stable environment. Trees were flickering between solid wood and pixelated, hollow wireframes. The sky above wasn't dark anymore. It was a swirling vortex of static, flashing between pitch black and a sickly, glowing white that had no source. The vertical snow had turned into a chaotic storm of ash-like particles that dissolved into nothingness before they touched the ground. I didn't look at my compass. I didn't trust my eyes. I trusted only the slope. As long as the ground went up, I was moving away from the center of the deletion. My breathing was a ragged, whistling gasp. The air felt thin, devoid of oxygen, as if the atmosphere itself was being pumped out of the valley. My bare left hand was completely numb, a stiff, glassy appendage that I had to tuck into my jacket pocket just to keep from striking it against the branches. Just keep moving? I muttered to myself, but my own voice sounded strange to my ears. It was muffled, flat, as if I were speaking through a heavy woolen blanket. The acoustic dampening was returning, but it wasn't the entity doing it this time. It was the world closing the wound. After what felt like hours of agonizing climbing, the terrain began to level off. The dense, flickering hemlocks gave way to the familiar, jagged rocks of the ridge line. I staggered through a final thicket of brush and fell forward onto the hard-packed, natural snow of the upper pass. I turned around, panting, my chest heaving as I looked back down into the valley. The canyon was gone. Where the deep, heavily forested valley had been just 3 hours ago, there was now only a flat, featureless plateau of gray granite. No trees, no creek, no snow, just a massive, smooth scar in the landscape, stretching for miles between the mountain ridges. It looked exactly like a section of a map that had been erased with a brutal, indifferent hand, leaving only the blank canvas underneath. The silence here was different. It wasn't the dead, predatory vacuum of the entity. It was the normal, quiet stillness of a high mountain winter night. A soft wind blew across the ridge, carrying the genuine scent of pine and ozone. The stars above were stable, sharp points of light in a clear, natural sky. I lay there for a long time, the cold of the real snow seeping through my trousers, reassuring me that I was back within the parameters of the known world. I had survived. I had kept my map. Slowly, painfully, I pulled my left hand out of my jacket pocket to inspect the damage. The translucency was gone. The dark blue veins had receded. But my skin was different now. It was entirely smooth, devoid of hair, pores, or lines. My fingerprints were completely gone, replaced by a uniform, pale gray texture that felt slightly cool to the touch. A permanent scar of the deletion zone. A receipt for my survival. I pulled my spare glove over the altered hand, stood up on shaking legs, and began the long, dark walk down the southern slope toward the ranger station at the highway. I had a story to tell, even if I knew no one would ever believe it.